All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending our session here today on addressing identity risk. My name is Jim Ducharme, and I'm the Vice President of Identity Products for RSA, the security division of Dell Technologies now. Today, I don't know how many of you were able to attend Dawn Marie's session in the last 25 minutes. A few of you. Good. There was a lot of common things that I'm going to touch on from Dawn's presentation. And actually, if you attended Patrick Harding's, the CTO of Ping, if you attended his keynote this morning, it builds on a lot of those aspects as well about identity risk and how we address that. Patrick talked about sort of 4 key elements of dealing with identity going forward, from automation to transparency and some of the human touch factors. We'll talk into some of that. What I was hoping to talk to you about today is, I think we've successfully scared the living hell out of everybody when it comes to the risk associated with identity. Years ago, we used to think about identity as how we became the heroes of IT or the business by enabling things like single sign-on and password synchronization. So we made it as easy as possible for users to access the resources that they needed. But the world has changed, and I'm going to talk about some of the dynamics of the environment that's changed that have all of a sudden made identity become the most consequential attack vector. That you may have heard that, or identity is the new perimeter. Again, there's a lot of messaging that's coming out that the great news is, for folks like us, that identity is back on the front page now of how to secure the stuff that's important to our enterprise. So what I'm hoping to achieve today is I'll help you understand sort of why identity is back on the front page, give you some practical advice of how to get beyond the rhetoric of things like identity is the most consequential attack vector. What do you actually do? And then how to measure that success. And the reason why that is we happen to notice, we run the RSA, the RSA conference as well, and we obviously have the show here at CIS, and I walk around things, like the show floors and things like that, and in the enterprise, it must be incredibly difficult to think about this looming fear of you better get this right or we're all going to die, to then being inundated with technology that all has little bells and whistles and all sorts of things to help you apply to solving this. So I'd like to take a step back from the technology for a second, come below sort of the rhetoric, and help you understand what is identity risk and how do you approach how you solve identity risk. We've estimated that there are over 1,500 companies that are in the security space that are helping you protect the enterprise. We meet customers all the time that have one of everything, right? We see every identity product there, and the sheer amount of technology doesn't necessarily address it, because we have to take a step back and say, have a strategy for what are the risks associated with identity, and then putting the right controls into place to make sure that we're addressing those. So let's start by just looking at what is identity risk. Identity risk can mean a lot of things, and I'm going to oversimplify it for you in a minute, but what is causing some of the risks that we face with identity today? Here are a list is just some of these pieces of the changing dynamics that have caused identity to get back on the front page of our security programs. We talk about islands of identity. That's a term that we use to talk about all the different types of applications and infrastructures that your users are using today. Gone are the days of all of your applications are safely stored behind the castle walls, behind the firewall, where you needed to be present in the building to actually access them because they're tethered to a network cable. Now more and more we're using cloud-based applications, SaaS applications, mobile applications, et cetera. These are the islands that we talk about that users are now venturing to get their job done. Many of these islands we like to call uncharted islands. These are the shadow IT applications that your IT organization doesn't even know that the business is using. Marketing is a huge user of shadow IT. Almost all marketing-based programs these days are SaaS-based applications that with the click of a button, marketing can enable to use to do their marketing analytics, lead generation, things like that. There are many other parts of the business as well that now don't rely on IT to roll out the things that make them successful. So those are some of the uncharted. I won't go through each one of these, but there's a couple other big trends. When we talk about BYOD and mobility, users expecting access from anywhere, from any device. I'm sure many of you have, your iPhone and an iPad tablet or some sort of tablet and your desktop. And you use them in different environments. Maybe you're working, from the conference here and you're doing a lot of work on your iPhone. Maybe when you go back to your room tonight, you might break out the iPad or even your laptop, and all in different locations. We're expected to work just about anywhere now, and we want that accessibility. Again, if we take the patterns of old that we use to protect identity, we would be bringing everybody back into the VPN and effectively extend those castle walls out to your iPhone, out to your mobile device, and that becomes a hindrance on the business user and how they get stuff done. So that's one of the other aspects that's changed here. A couple other quick things, increasing regulatory and compliance scrutiny. Sarbanes-Oxley, over 10 years old now, but the reality is that what got you compliant 10 years ago doesn't work anymore. The level of scrutiny going on of do you understand who has access to what in your environment is bigger than ever before, and it's only going to increase. Some other key trends here, we talk about the on-premise applications as well. We can all talk about how wonderful the cloud is, how it enables our business to grow faster, and the levels of scale, the reduction of IT, how easy it is. But we still have on-prem stuff. How many of you remember, a couple decades ago, they say, when the web came out, it was like, good, the death of the mainframe. How's that working, right? There is still on-prem. So more than ever, our organizations, what those applications are, those islands of identity, are just becoming more complex. So we have to deal with this reality that users are accessing applications on-prem, in the cloud, in our private cloud, in a hybrid cloud, and in SaaS applications that we don't manage or control at all. Privileged access management. Dawn was talking about years ago that identity management used to just be about provisioning, and she's absolutely right. As a matter of fact, probably 15 years ago, privileged access management kind of wasn't a thing, right? It really wasn't a thing, and now that's the biggest driver in identity spend these days is around privileged access management solutions. And I'm going to come back to this topic because these are important applications for your infrastructure. But I want to set the frame for what they're doing for you, what part of identity risk they're dealing with, and maybe more importantly, what parts of identity risk they aren't. And lastly is the expanding populations. Again, no different than users are accessing things more and more from different types of devices from different locations. Our businesses look different than they did decades ago, where everybody was an employee, chained to a desk, chained to a network connection. We're using more and more third parties to get our work done, right? There are more and more partnership types of opportunities that we're doing, ecosystems in these markets than ever before. And so all of these things are just some of the changing dynamics that have caused identity to become the most consequential attack vector. We could talk all day about things like, how passwords are a big weak spot in our organization, how password synchronization has just mirrored that, single sign-on, all these things. But these are some of the things but those have been in existence for well over a decade. Some of these are the trends that actually make those more of a risk factor than ever before. I don't think I have to tell this crowd what the consequences are for not responding to this, but I'm gonna boil this down into what I like to call the two scary monsters of identity, right? One is the security breach, the external attacker, the 400-pound attacker that President Trump talked about during his campaign that was coming to steal all our stuff, that was sleeping on the couch or whatever he was doing. That's the threat of the security breach, somebody stealing your stuff, right? That's one very real scary monster that we worry about. But I'll be honest with you, the scarier monster, when I talk to CISOs and our customers, and I ask them who's chasing them in their nightmares, a lot of times it's not the 400-pound attacker that's coming to steal all their stuff, it's the auditor. It's the fear of non-compliance, because there are real tangible risks and consequences to not being compliant this day and age. Our attempts to deal with these, especially these two scary monsters of security and compliance, have caused us to roll out so many different tools. Dawn showed a great picture. I may actually steal it. Don't tell her. But she shows the locks on the doors, where there was this door and it's got 100 locks on it. We have a video that we show that's very similar to that, where we put all these controls into place to keep the bad guys out, or to make sure that we're compliant, all at the expense of our business users and our business productivity. So we need to figure out, how do we ensure that we can keep these monsters of identity at bay, at the same time not becoming a barrier to business productivity, but how do we actually help accelerate that? So how do we actually address and mitigate and manage identity risks? Again, it starts with what is identity risk, right? We've talked about the fears, we talked about why it exists, but what are they? I'm going to break it down into two dimensions. Wish I had a little clicker. I'm going to break identity risk into two dimensions. One we're going to call access assurance, and one identity assurance. Access assurance is all about, are you sure that people have appropriate access? What do they have access to, and is it appropriate? That's what we like to call access assurance. Do they have access to the people that have access? Are they the right people that have access to the right stuff? We're going to dig into that dimension of identity risk here today and look at what some of the risk factors are underneath that context. The second dimension of identity risk we call identity assurance. Now that you have appropriate access, are the people that show up actually who they claim to be? Some of you say, oh, that's authentication, right? More and more as we look at the authentication market, we're going to go beyond things like the word authentication, which is a verb, right? I'm going to make you do something. Give me a password. What's your mother's maiden name? Give me a fingerprint. Wink at me. Smile at me. Stand on one foot. Whatever that is, those are methods that we make, those are rituals we make users go through to prove they are who they say they are. As you may have heard Patrick talk about this morning, as you may have heard any one of us talk about all the time, we're going to move beyond the hoops that we make users go through to leverage context and information to help make sure that we understand that people are who they claim to be. Okay? Everything from behavioral analytics to regular patterns of usage to device information, location information, a number of different things to help us build an assurance that this person is who they say they are with as little input from the user as we can possibly handle, as we can possibly use to raise a level of assurance. But we're not going to spend a lot of time on identity assurance today. I'm going to encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, we actually do another session, not here at CIS, unfortunately, but this is going to be posted on our rsa.com website, that we talk about our authentication piece and the identity assurance piece, where we go into all of the actual risk elements around identity assurance and how you can actually address this identity assurance piece. So today I'm going to focus much more on access assurance. Again, how do we know who has access to what? So there are really 5 elements when we talk about access assurance. There are 5 approaches here that I want to talk about, or 5 key ingredients of how to implement a risk-driven strategy to manage that identity risk. We're going to start by enabling just a risk and context-driven governance. What do I mean by this? This is about identity governance to start with. Don talked about this in the last session. You have to know what you're trying to protect first. Where's your stuff? Where are the crown jewels? Okay? So we start by and then secondly, we start by understanding the business aspect of these things, right? So this may be, you may know this as things like data classification, even just having an inventory of where your stuff is. We'll talk about effective means for doing that, but it all starts with, how do we actually understand what we're trying to protect, what the impact to our business is if it's compromised, how important, and how is it deployed? Is it a cloud-based application? Is it on-prem? We need to start looking at the compensating controls that already exist around it. So for example, let's say we had a traditional on-prem application. We start to look at things like, how do people get access to it if it's behind the firewall? These are all examples like firewall, or even hooking two-factor authentication up to an application or what have you, are all compensating controls we put around applications to protect them. The applications that exist on-prem have a very different risk posture than perhaps a SaaS-based application that the business is using in the cloud. We have to understand those differences. How do we do that? It begins with an inventory. We could talk about whether these are manual exercises or you buy a product like a GRC solution that helps you do this, but it really is about doing a risk assessment of your environment, your applications, and your data, understanding where things live. Okay? We want to look at almost everything. Almost every system or data that we have in our environment has the notion of privileged identity. Okay? A privileged identity, many of us think of privileged identity as God accounts on things like Unix boxes, like root accounts, or on Windows machines. It might be an administrator account, right, et cetera. These are what they call God accounts. as we start to think about privileged identities, you need to open your aperture to what a privileged identity is, where it's somebody that can actually change either who can access this application, what this application looks like, what data is in it, can manipulate the application in some substantial way other than just an end user. So we need to start to identify with these applications, we absolutely need to identify administrative logins. We need to identify system-related logins as well. Things that actually can change the application itself. Start to identify which of those accounts in these applications are actually privileged accounts, okay? And again, this is just a taking stock of what's there and asking the question of, in each of these applications, what are the privileged identities in here? Do we know what they are? Let's enumerate them. Then we can begin to talk about the controls that we want to put into place to effectively manage those. And by the way, the same is true for shared accounts. Shared accounts, privileged accounts, when you have administrative accounts or some kind of an account that you can't map to a belly button, right? We can't map that to a human being. We want to enumerate those as well, because that's a different risk factor, that we have something that multiple people use that we want to put different compensating controls on to address. The next strategy here is now you're going to have a ton of data. You've got thousands of applications. You're going to spend time looking at for your uncharted islands, those SaaS applications that exist in the line of business. You have to find the applications and information that drive your business where it lives, whether or not it's controlled by IT or not. Again, that's important. Too many times I see our customers, when they look at the scope of this, they're looking at, these are the applications that we roll out. And I always ask them, what about the uncharted islands? What about the shadow IT apps? Not my job, I don't own those. But you own a responsibility to protect it, okay? So that's that. Next, now that you have all of this information, we need to start making sense of what's normal. So we talk about discovering outliers or inappropriate access. This is where we can actually use this information, a level of analytics, right, that we can look for patterns of access. Many of us have probably embarked on this in the past for a different reason, by doing something like role mining. Role mining was a way that we could look for these common patterns to say, oh, look, we can create this definition of a role, and so when I want to give somebody access to something, I can just give them the role, and that gives them all the stuff that the role entails. Over the years, we've all deployed, potentially many of us have deployed role mining products to help us find those patterns, to help us design those. We'll use a lot of those same analytics today to actually not only look for the patterns of things that make sense, but look for the patterns, the outliers, the things that don't make sense. I can't explain this user's access to this application. Nobody else that looks like that user has similar access. And when I look at the population of people that have the same access, it just looks very different. It stands out, right? So we can use this information and we can use analytics over that to begin to look for the outliers, okay? At the same time, we can also start to look for what makes sense. So I like to call this section sort of the turn down the noise, turn up the funk, right? So turn down the noise is, let's try to identify what makes sense, right? So I always say in my organization, when I have a development organization, developers having access to my source control system is not a surprise to anyone. That makes sense, okay? My sales team having access to Salesforce.com, not a big surprise, okay? And we can look for those patterns of things that make sense, and maybe we're turning those into roles, maybe we're using those in an access-based, an attribute-based access control type of a system. But again, that's an access control system, that's an implementation of using that data. We want to start by finding ways that we can find these patterns of things that make sense, so we can turn down the noise, as well as look for those things that really don't make sense. I saw in somebody else's presentation today, where they talked about some sort of basic policies that you put into place, like things like, developers shouldn't have access to production data, okay? There is if somebody violates that, if that happens, somebody's got some splaining to do. So we all talk about how we want to get away from, policy-based systems or declarative systems. Absolutely true. We don't want to have everything in the world defined by static policies, because those are the easiest things to break in. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some very core principles that we want to make sure are true. People having access to production data, we need to reinforce those. Segregations of duties. We need to look for these toxic combinations. Does that mean we shoot on site? Does that mean when we see a user with a segregation of duties policies that we fire them and have them murdered in the back alley? Hell no. It's just a way to call our attention to something that doesn't make sense. Okay? So as we look for these outliers and we look for this, we're also putting into place things like segregations of duties. We're also looking for things like orphaned accounts. Can we map an account in an application to a belly button? Do we know the human who's in control of the account? Go back to my notion of shared accounts. Humans, sometimes. And again, we want to especially call out those shared accounts where there's multiple people here. Again, that's a risk exposure. So if something were to happen inappropriate with that account, now I got multiple people I got explaining to do. Okay? So the second step here is really to discover those outliers, inappropriate access. Try to establish rules of norm. Okay? As well as rules for things that, you know, if you spot, you really want to call out. Surface meaningful information for decision makers. So in this one here, this is really all about, now that we find these sort of information about risk and priorities, surface that information. If you're doing governance programs today and that involves your business users reviewing access on a periodic basis, i.e. what Sarbanes-Oxley 404 tells you to do, don't take the Where's Waldo approach to this, where you just throw all the data in front of them and say, spot the bad guy, right? We want to take some of this information to help surface sort of a context to say what they should look at. So what do we mean by that? We should be looking at things like grouping particular types of access, like privileged access, et cetera. And so using that information, and no different than if we were to think about a SOC, a Security Operations Center, we wouldn't expect the SOC to look at every single thing that comes across the radar. We want to help provide some context to identify, to really focus their attention on the things that really need their, as Patrick calls it, human intervention. We don't need them to look at everything. We need them to look at the things that don't make sense, that we need the human touch on to really explain. Next is automate processes. Again, now, I supported the human factor a second ago. Now I'm going to say take the human factor out. Automate what you can, and Patrick's tenets was this as well, which is things like join and move a lever processes. When you have a new hire, hopefully you're using these patterns of norm to give them access automatically. Again, whether you use roles, whether you hate roles, whether you like ABAC, or whether you just want a rule that says, when I hire a new developer, you give them these birthright access, or even an employee, you give them that access, automate that. When you detect an identity attribute changes that shows that an individual has moved in the organization, don't wait for a manager to tell you that they moved. Automate the process of going, somebody moved, we might want to think about that. And lastly, and I would say most importantly, as you identify these risk factors, measure your success. What do I mean by that? As we look at things like orphaned accounts, how many orphaned accounts do we have in the organization? How many out-of-role entitlements do we have? How many entitlements can we not explain because we're lacking access request information? Measure that, put your controls into place, and see if it's working. If it's not working, stop doing it. If it is working, do more of it. It's that simple. I see too many customers that have put compensating controls into place that aren't working. Measure your success. The other thing that does is it helps you promote within your organization that you're actually making a difference and you can quantify it. All right, this slide I actually put up. I'm going to gloss over this really quickly. The other piece here that I would ask you to look at is the things on the left are sort of the things you better care about in terms of what you have to govern, what you have to manage lifecycle over. The pieces that surround that pretty colored circle are some of the things I want you to think about for those 4 key tenets that I just showed, the 5 key tenets that I just showed you around automating provisioning, simple access requests. All of those things that I mentioned can apply here. So for example, automated fulfillment. When you think about automated fulfillment, that's automating the provisioning. So, making it so no human has to go in and provision access to a system on the back end. Don't necessarily seek for 100% coverage over that. Do what makes sense. If you have an application that really changes, if you have an application that is lower risk, maybe your energy is best spent on a different compensating control. It may actually be cheaper for you to hire a help desk center that maybe there's a higher error rate with that, but Again, this is all about prioritizing your investment in your compensating controls of identity risk. I see a lot of customers trying to spend all of their energy, their time, their money on actually automating 100%. When I look at basic things and I say, at the same time, that same customer that's trying to automate the provisioning to this Power Builder app they rolled out 15 years ago, I'm like, you don't even have like strong authentication on your privileged identities. Oh, we'll get to that after we provision everything automated fashion. So, you know, you've got to make sense out of that and apply these metrics back again to measure progress in each of these areas. Okay, almost done here. The other piece that I'll mention with respect to identity risk is too many times we're looking at identity in our silos of IAM. One of my problems with this market is that we tend to just look at our identity controls, and even many times we look at these markets as distinct things, that, you know, access control is different than authentication, is different than governance, is different than lifecycle, and we look at them in silos. These are all related, and we must bring them together. But not only within identity, we need to look outside of identity and how this information and how identity risk is affected by other parts of the organization. So IAM meets GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. Okay? This is where, as I started this conversation, I talked about doing your assessments, of knowing what's there. GRC programs are largely doing this today. They're doing application risk assessments. That gives you information about the risk, about not only what you're trying to protect, but the risk to the business that gives you context of how to properly protect it. Privileged access management, again, as I said in the beginning, there are great privileged access management solutions out there. You know, and I've mentioned a couple here just as an example of CyberArk and Lieberman that we look at. These are great controls to make sure that when a belly button wants to show up and do privileged things on, let's say, I need root access to that Unix account, that we can tie my activity, Jim's activity, to doing that privileged activity. That's what privileged access management solutions are great at. Giving me that access without giving me the root password, recording what I do to make sure that it's appropriate. But over these systems, you need to make sure that you have a proper governance and lifecycle strategy to ensure that you understand who has access, what belly buttons have access, have privileged access, is it appropriate, and how do you manage that as they move? Make sure privileged access tends to be the keys to the kingdom. Identity assurance. So when I talk about identity assurance, again, full circle, think authentication, proving people are who they say they are. This is the other opportunity that we have of, when you think life cycle, how do I give somebody access to something? And then you think authentication and access management, how people, the control points to how they get access. Let's start to share information there. So the more access that's appropriate, the more we start to, for example, in our access management systems or authentication solutions, what are people actually using? If you want to get to least privileged access, clean out the attic of entitlements of the things that users aren't using. The only way you know that is to understand where people are going. Access management solutions, authentication solutions are great sources of data to understand what people are actually doing with their access that they have. And if you can marry those two sources of information about what people are doing, thanks to the evidence you have from access management and authentication solutions, with your governance and lifecycle solutions, you can provide better insights into, is that access appropriate? The last piece that isn't up here that I'll say, and I think is probably the most important, which is probably why I left it off, I don't know, is integration with your SOC, with your security teams. They're monitoring threats to your environment every single day, every single minute. Leverage that both ways. Many times, your SOCs are looking at things from a network application perspective, not from an identity perspective. They might, at best, see a user account that's being attempted to be hacked or something like that. They don't know that DUCJA1, which is my ID, is the same as jim@ducharme.us, is the same as these other accounts. Your governance solution helps tie all these disparate identities that I have to access SaaS applications, mainframes, et cetera, helps tie that together. That is visibility that your SOC does not have. Similarly, your SOC gets information of, that's weird, we think there's a threat actor over here. We can identify where we think he is, and he's trying to get into something. The SOC should be informing your identity controls to say, this doesn't make any sense. So we can start to inform our access management solutions, our authentication solutions, and our governance solutions of how people can access this application. So that's the quick and dirty of that. And finally, I'll close with, these are some of the capabilities. This is your to-do list, right? This is when you think about risks, I want you to think through these bullets, and you can take a picture or whatever. But these are just some of the capabilities that you should be looking at in your organization to decide if you're really on top of some of the risk factors that are behind identity risk. Okay? Are you looking for things like unauthorized change detection? When you see somebody get access, do you know why they got access? Do you know where did it come from? If you can't trace it, put compensating controls in there. Join removal leaver policies, centralized privileged access management here. And what I mean by that is not just the PAM solution in place, but do you have the right governance and lifecycle controls to manage who has access to the PAM solutions? And all these pieces. I'm happy to answer more questions on that. Sorry I'm running over here, but I hope this was helpful to sort of take the fear factor that we've all presented now with identity as the risk factors above the technology to sort of think about these are the check boxes of the things that you should be looking for in your environment. Are you solving these risk factors in your identity environment? Thank you very much.